Hello everyone. Today we will learn about Mayer's 12 Multimedia Design Principles. I am Darlene Aguilar, and I'm a contracted instructional design librarian at Loyola Marymount University. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to understand the relationship between the multimedia principles and memory, identify multimedia principles used in media, identify the violation of multimedia principles used in media. And by media, I mean anything from tutorials to PowerPoint presentations to handouts, anything used to deliver instruction. So today's lesson will give you research-based strategies you can use immediately to create effective instruction. Now I want to show you an example of a typical tutorial. How does memory actually work? As human senses experience the environment, information enters what is called sensory memory or the sensory register. While some information is lost, selected information will be organized in working memory. This information is then integrated or encoded into long-term memory, where it can be retrieved at a later time. Take a second to think about how you felt while watching the video. Do you think you can learn effectively from videos like this? Pause the video now to reflect. We will revisit the video at the end of this lesson to apply what we have learned and identify which multimedia design principles are used and which are violated. Some of you may have been more distracted watching the video than others. If you don't know much about how memory works, which is what the video was trying to teach you, then you would have a harder time learning the information from that video than someone who did have prior knowledge on the subject. And that brings us to our first multimedia design principle. Individual differences states that design effects are stronger for low-knowledge learners than for high-knowledge learners. All the principles we will go over today are more for novice learners, those with low prior knowledge on the subject. For learners who are experts or have a lot of prior knowledge, these principles will not benefit them. They will learn the material either way with or without these principles. We also need to talk about the basics of memory so that you can understand why these principles are useful. When we experience our environment, we take in all of the sensory information through our senses, but only selected information goes into our working memory because our working memory has a very limited capacity and can only hold information for a limited amount of time, unless we are actively trying to process and remember the information. If we are successful, then the information will go into our long-term memory. Students haven't learned until the information has been transferred into long-term memory. The main takeaway from this slide is that working memory has a limited capacity, and it is our job as instructors to avoid overloading the working memory of novice learners. In this picture, someone is literally filtering out unnecessary information. The multimedia design principles guide us to manage cognitive overload by deleting distracting elements and inserting helpful ones so that learners can process information in their limited working memories. That brings us to our second principle, coherence. Students learn better when extraneous words, pictures, and sounds are excluded rather than included. And that goes back to managing cognitive overload. The filter is taking out anything that isn't necessary. Let's look at an example. Take a second to read this slide. So this is a typical lesson slide about how scholarly information takes time to create. But there are a lot of extraneous pictures here. The border of hourglasses, the boy standing near a calendar. These decorative images are only slightly related to the topic. We need to avoid decorative images and instead use relevant graphics like this. Here I have decluttered the slide and included a meaningful graphic. People use decorative graphics because they are easy to find, whereas meaningful graphics usually need to be created. But we need to get rid of any images, sounds, or words that are not relevant to the lesson. Don't include fun facts that will distract learners. Don't include music or other sounds as learners are trying to read or hear the narration for the lesson. All of those are unnecessary elements that cause cognitive overload. The multimedia principle states, students learn better from words and pictures than from words alone. And I've seen some tutorials like this, just full of words. You don't have to read this, it's just an example of a wordy slide. We all have heard of the phrase show, don't just tell, and we can still do that in our tutorials. Adding graphics will only help novice learners, but it also helps students who learned English as a second language. This lesson is teaching students about Boolean operators, and one way to improve on this lesson is to draw Venn diagrams. But I have another way. Here I have the same lesson on Boolean operators, but using the example of clothing color. Now I have a visual representation of how the operator or, and not work. So I have taken all of that text and turned it into narration with graphics to improve learning. So just to review, the last principle, coherence, wanted us to eliminate any unnecessary information. And now this principle, the multimedia principle, wants us to add relevant graphics. So eliminate the unnecessary and add the relevant. Up next, we have the spatial contiguity principle that states, students learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented near rather than far from each other on the page or screen. So spatial contiguity items need to be together in space. If you're trying to teach students where things are located in the library, this map format will take students longer to learn and it will be harder to recall. I know that these words don't look like they are very far from the picture, but remember that working memory has a limited capacity and you are asking students to remember a number, a label, and a location while looking back and forth from the map to the legend. There is a better way. The words inside the map is what we mean by together in space. This is a better setup that doesn't require you to go back and forth and doesn't cause cognitive overload. I know I'm just showing you an example of one floor, but this is actually a 3-story building, so it can get overwhelming very easily. So remember to do this with your lessons and put the corresponding words close to the graphics. So spatial contiguity was together in space, but we have a similar principle with time. Temporal contiguity states that students learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented simultaneously rather than successively. Temporal contiguity wants you to present material together in time. There are some lessons that try to separate the narration from the image or video. Here we have our Boolean operators lesson again, but the button says, click here to hear a description, and click here to see an animation. This is asking students to remember all of the narration and combine it with the animation, but because working memory is limited in its capabilities, students will likely go back and forth from one to the other as they struggle to combine the information received, which is not an efficient way to learn. So it is best to have the narration and graphic presented simultaneously in the same slide. The signaling principle states that students learn better when cues, such as underlining and arrows, are added that highlight the main ideas and organization of the words. For example, bolding new terms lets students know that this term is important. Signaling also draws the learner's attention to certain elements of the lesson. If you were teaching students how to read library records and showed a page like this, you need to be aware that this is overwhelming for students who are likely seeing this page for the first time. There is too much going on in the page. So to draw their attention to certain aspects, you can zoom into parts of the page, or you can use an arrow when talking about requesting items. You can highlight where to check if the item is available in the library, or you can circle important information. But remember to include the signaling at the same time as your narration per the temporal contiguity principle. When you try to follow one principle, you should not violate another. The pacing principle states that students learn better when they control the pacing of segmented, narrated animation rather than having a continuous pace. Well, why is that? Well, when you go at your own pace, you can make sure that you fully understand a slide before moving to the next, but you can also go back to that slide if you need a refresher. This video is at a continuous pace, but you have the video controls so you can pause and rewind at your own time. When you design video tutorials, make sure that the video controls are available for students to use so that they can pause the recording if needed and use the closed captioning if they couldn't understand or hear you correctly. Programs like Articulate Storyline and Captivate are a lot better with pacing. They have previous and next buttons, but there's also this menu available so that if you need a refresher later, you can easily skip ahead to a certain slide. If you're using these programs, try to keep these pacing controls available to students. The modality principle states that students learn better from animation and narration than from animation and on-screen text. I want you to experience this for yourselves. So I'm going to give you an example that I made up. And while watching it, try to be aware of your experiences of trying to read the on-screen text and follow the related animation at the same time. What is your reaction to that video? Pause the video now to reflect. So in this video, your attention was split between the on-screen text and the video animation. Your eyes were darting from one to the other because your working memory cannot pay attention to all that information at the same time. The best thing to do here is to remove the on-screen text and use narration instead. That way you can watch the video and hear the explanation of the video at the same time. If you had a still picture, then having the on-screen text wouldn't be a problem as long as you followed the other multimedia design principles. The redundancy principle is very similar to the modality principle. It states that students learn better from animation and narration than from animation, narration, and on-screen text. So what's the difference? We know from the modality principle that you should have narration and animation, but the redundancy principle makes sure that you exclude the verbatim text. It's redundant to have the same text as the narration. Now there is a clarification needed. Including some words is okay because it can act as signaling. So if I am providing a narration to this video about Boolean operators, the words red or blue, red and blue, red not blue will only help learners. So short amounts of printed text is okay to use with animation. The concept's first principle states, students learn better when new terms are learned before introducing complex processes, principles, or procedures. So explain the concepts and define the terms before expecting students to do something with it. For example, before expecting students to use databases, it is useful to give them a tour and define terms that they may not know the definition to, like the word peer-reviewed. The personalization principle states, students learn better when narration is conversational and uses personal pronouns such as you and yours. So don't be too formal with your lessons. The conversational style is used to induce your learners to engage with the computer. Learners tend to work harder to understand the material when they feel like they are in a conversation rather than simply receiving information from a machine. However, there is such a thing as too conversational to the point of distraction if, for example, you are using slang terms. Personalization also includes putting yourself in the narrative. One example from LMU is that we include the photos of our librarians on the research guides. This makes librarians more approachable and shows who developed the research guides. Finally, we have the human voice principle that states, students learn better when a human voice is used for narration rather than a machine voice or a foreign accented voice. And I have another video example for you.
The peer review process works like this. When an author submits an article to a scholarly journal, it is evaluated for both accuracy in content and suitability for publication by a group of experts or peers from the same field as the author. If the outside experts believe it's good research, they give the author suggestions for further improvements to the article and the author revises it and sends it back to be reviewed again.
Would you be able to learn from a video like this? Pause the video now to reflect. So that video had a text-to-speech voiceover, which is extremely hard to understand, especially if you're new to the subject. Please try to avoid using this robot-type voice. So those were all 12 principles, but I want to go back to the original video that was shown. Watch this video again and think about which principles are being followed and which are being violated. Even if you don't remember the principle name, try to describe it. What helps learning and what distracts from learning? How does memory actually work? As human senses experience the environment, information enters what is called sensory memory or the sensory register. While some information is lost, selected information will be organized in working memory. This information is then integrated or encoded into long-term memory where it can be retrieved at a later time. Pause here to gather your thoughts. Here we have all of the principles listed. The ones with an X were violated in the video, and the ones with a check mark were used correctly, and the rest were not very applicable. I suggest you pause the video to review these. Some of these are more obvious than others, but I will clarify a few of them. I marked spatial and temporal contiguity as not applicable because there were no relevant pictures included. These principles only apply when the graphic is just as relevant as the words. For the pacing principle, I should point out that this was a YouTube video and so the controls were present. Finally, I marked the personalization principle as violated because the language used is very formal. It starts off by saying, "as human senses," rather than "as your senses." The character on the screen is more for decoration than personalization, and the words "you" and "yours" are never mentioned. I have a few book recommendations if you want to learn more about these principles and the research behind them. I suggest reading E-Learning and the Science of Instruction by Clark and Mayer, and if you just want an introductory book on instructional design, I recommend Applying the Science of Learning, which is also by Mayer. Thank you for watching this presentation. I will likely make more in the future, so please follow my social media accounts for other instructional tips.